just want to read you some verses from Romans, from the Message. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. I belong to a fitness club and go once a week, or at least I did. Now it's zoomed into our homes because of lockdown, but normally I would go once a week to this fitness group, which is called Reboot Camp. Now I've come across fitness groups called Boot Camp before, but not Reboot Camp. And so one day I said to the instructor, why do you call it that? And she said, because I think we need a holistic approach to fitness. We have some intensive exercises, so that deals with your physical body. We do 5 to 10 minutes of relaxation and meditation, so that deals with your mind. And then we finish up with what she calls a cheesy quote, but it's a kind of thought for the day, just a sentence, just to get people thinking, and that deals with the spiritual side of things. And she said, we need to have all those things, so to reboot ourselves so that we can live as we should be living. I thought, yeah, that's pretty good, actually. So what I've done is I've called today's teaching session Reboot, but it's not Reboot for fitness, it's Reboot for the church. And together we're going to be looking at, I'm going to try to pull together what Joe's been saying about the vision, the backdrop of COVID and all of that, and where we go from here. So I'm trying to broaden it out a little bit. There's quite a lot in it, so I have put together a PowerPoint, which I'm going to start sharing with you in a moment. And so you won't see me, you'll just see the PowerPoint, just to give us a structure and a framework to make it easier to follow. If you can't see it because you're looking on a phone, don't worry, because I will be reading everything that's on the screen and just expanding on it. It's just to give you something to focus on if you're on a laptop. And you will see it on the recording. The PowerPoint will come up on the recording later on as well. So the first slide that comes up, which is coming up now as we're sharing the screen, is the photograph that I took at Corbar Cross just earlier this week in the fog when we were up there. So that's just to set the context. Okay, so drawing together what we've got, just a bit of an outline. First of all, the first thing we're going to look at is the backdrop to where we are at the moment, the COVID-19 stuff, the church vision and values, and a bit about the bigger picture. Then from that, I'm going to go on and talk about the opportunity that gives us. John's already mentioned opportunity. I'm going to expand on that. And then I'm going to finish up with what do we do about it? What's our response as individuals living in and around Buxton? How can we go from here? So that's where we're going to be going. So I'm going to start with the COVID-19 stuff. So that's the first thing. Just want to explore a little bit about that and the fact that we're now in lockdown 2, and this might not be the last lockdown that we're in. So a few of the things that COVID has actually brought to the table, if you like. First of all, it's challenged us to ask questions about the nature of the world around us and the values we want to live by. It's made us think, what actually is it really important to us? Is it stuff? Is it people? What is it? It's made us question how we want to live. It's helped us to celebrate perhaps more the ordinary, or perhaps more what I would call ordinary people. So instead of celebrating footballers and celebrities and all of those kind of people on Strictly that John's very keen on talking about, it's actually made us think about the people maybe who we don't normally give accolade to, like the bin men, the delivery drivers, the supermarket stackers, the NHS workers, from all of them, down to your senior consultants, down to, you know, across the board, right through to hospital porters, catering staff. It's made us appreciate those kind of people who normally just get taken for granted. But now we realise how important everybody is to our society. It's also made us think about global injustice and inequality, particularly looking at the disproportionate impact that the virus does have on ethnic minorities. And that's kind of, together with some of the other issues of inequality, that's been brought to a head during this time of the virus as well. Then we've had environmental destruction being talked about. There's a very complex relationship between environmental destruction, global deprivation, and the kind of facilities which have encouraged the emergence of this virus. This virus isn't totally aside of us. We have contributed to an environment which has enabled the virus to actually jump and spread from animals to people. And we have to recognise that. And against that backdrop, all of that, it's made us think, actually, is there an alternative way to live? Do we want to actually live in a better way? So I think that's come across society as a whole over the last 8 to 10 months. But of course, into that, we've got the vision and values of our church. So moving on to this slide, these are some of the things that Jo's been bringing. I'm not going to go and expand them all because she's taken a month or 5 weeks to talk about them, and the videos are all on YouTube. But essentially, she was talking about coming to the table, having a vision that creates accessible spaces, maybe having something like a hope hub, where we can actually encourage other people to come to the table and to join us there. She talked about values of hospitality, authenticity, inclusion, diversity, and community, where all are welcome. She quoted Romans 3, verse 23, that we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're all in it up to our necks. There's not a cigarette paper between us. So we can't make judgments and distinctions about who's worthy and who isn't. None of us are, but we're all welcome. Then the wider church leadership team's been talking about the source. What does that mean for the source? Where do we go from there? Do we keep it? Or do we sell it? Is it holding us back? Or do we need to be free to do other things? Into all of this came a picture that John brought and commented on, I think, a couple of weeks ago about the waves. A wave of water coming, and then a second wave, which was sort of representing the virus. And the sense of what do we do with the second wave? Do we stay on the beach and wait for it all to go away and go back to normal? Or do we swim through that wave and embrace the change that's about to come? And then Andy, a couple of weeks ago, was talking about bringing the kingdom of God and discipleship to a post-COVID world. And we've been given all of that information in the last few weeks. And I haven't forgotten last week, and I'll come back to last week as well in a few minutes. So to be a people of, I read a quote, a sentence from, it's actually from a Tearfund writer called Gideon Hugh, and he said, and this really reminded me of the beach, he said, to be a people of hope doesn't mean we turn away from the brokenness, it means we stride into it. And that's from an article called When Hope Hurts, Faith and Despair in a Pandemic. So I thought it was interesting that other people, not just the prophecy that John brought, but other people are actually saying we need to get out there, get involved in what's actually going on. So moving on to the bigger picture. So that's kind of where we're at, the COVID-19 stuff and the vision and values of Buxton Church in the Peak, but actually looking a little bit more broadly at the bigger picture. We live in Buxton, but actually, where does our vision stop? We're often told that the Buxton Church in the Peak incorporates Buxton and the surrounding villages, but is that it? Or is it Derbyshire? Or is it the UK? Or, as we heard last week, does it involve places like Kenya and Turning Point? Or is it planet Earth? How can we build back better? What is the church's role? And how far is that limited? Is it just in Buxton, or does it go beyond that? The pandemic has given society the rare opportunity to ask questions about who we are and about our place in the world. And for Christians, how do we embody the values of Christ's kingdom and point people to a better way of living in the middle of all of this hurt and brokenness? The Christian faith calls us to not rush in with answers, but to sit with the questions and then to move. We believe that suffering and sickness are not what God actually intended for the world, and we're to follow Jesus in bringing hope and healing. That's the Father heart of God at every level. Responding to people's needs at all levels and living in ways that allow the wider creation to flourish is what God would want. And that means we need a more sustainable approach, because we can't, if we want wider creation to flourish, we can't destroy it in actually, well, we're actually trying to help people. We got to get the balance between the two. Somebody said of the pandemic, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Globally, the first lockdown has meant cramped living conditions, increasing debt, no access to school lessons, and some days without food, and that's just in the UK. Andy explored this in his talk last week. And the World Bank suggests that 60 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty globally by this pandemic. That's getting on for the population of this country, but obviously spread across the globe. Do you sense a restlessness, a wanting to move things forwards towards perfection? Do you feel that the kingdom of God is here on earth and you want it to extend into Buxton and beyond? Is there a holy dissatisfaction with where things are at the moment? Is there a constant pull for change? If so, I would suggest that that reflects the verses in Romans 8, verses 15 to 25. I'm just going to read them now. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship and the redemption of our bodies. For this, in this hope, we were saved. Walter Brueggemann is a well-known theologian, and he's taken those words and linked them into the pandemic. And he says, says there's a link between creation groaning and the need for justice and liberation of all the Israelite slaves. He says that has distinct resonances with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in June 2020. Those who've lived with inequality and prejudice for so long have finally been pushed to the limit as the injustice of their situation is laid bare by the virus. Will this lead to change? And there have been some positives. People's commenting on, I know, and certainly know that Mike and I found this when we went out cycling during the first lockdown, there was no traffic anywhere on the roads. It was great. We could cycle down the middle of the road and we didn't have to worry about somebody coming up behind us or in the opposite direction. It was great. And there are other people talking about the bird song, listening to the bird song. So there have been some benefits, although it has been there's been some massive negatives and massive disadvantages. There have been some positives. And it has shocked us, I think, those glimpses have shocked us into realising that another world is possible. And it's just sort of drawn a curtain back onto what else there could be. And then into this backdrop, Joe unleashed the new vision onto I don't know that it was an unsuspecting church, but Joe brought this new vision. How do we implement this in the Buxton and more widely in the present context? Just want to read some words from 2 Corinthians, which says, "We're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Yeah, it's tricky. Yes, it's difficult, but we are going to swim through this bigger wave. Which brings us on to the opportunity that it actually gives us. Now, last night we were raising money for an organisation called Tearfund, and a lot of you will have come across it before. It's an organisation based in the UK, but it operates globally, and it has 3 kind of objectives. The first one is to help communities learn how to escape from poverty, and that's what we heard last night. Secondly, it's disaster ready, and it has mechanisms in place so that when there's a natural disaster like flooding or earthquakes or something like that, it can get people out to the front line very, very quickly indeed. But the other thing it does, it works to change laws and lifestyles in the UK and elsewhere. They don't just ask for money to help, they actually will actually get on the ground and help people, but they will actually try to change rules in this country as well. And that organisation have identified 3 national shifts towards the kingdom of God during the pandemic. The first national shift that they've noticed is a change in emphasis from me to we together. And in the UK, there's been a surge of activism with people creating new expressions of community. A couple of weeks ago, we had a WhatsApp message from our village WhatsApp chain with somebody suggesting that in the run up to Christmas, they were going to take some stuff to the food bank in Buxton. Would anybody in the village like to donate anything? They've been absolutely inundated with offers, and actually today they're doing a pickup from the houses in the village. They've had so much stuff that I don't think they're going to be able to get there in one vehicle. It's going to be several vehicles going to be needed to actually transport all that stuff up to the food bank. But that's an indication of people working together, not just buying stuff for ourselves, but just saying, actually, we can give out of what we've got to other people. Interestingly, the spread of the disease actually relies on us working together. If one of us gets the disease, we need to isolate, we need to track and trace, we need to isolate, and we need to work together to stop that disease passing to other people. We depend on one another. And if we don't do that, if we don't isolate, if we don't follow the rules, then actually we spread it and make it worse. We need to work together. Second thing Tearfund have picked out is that we've gone from valuing productivity above all else and our success to actually valuing life. And there have been indications, particularly in the first lockdown, of people who've been homeless people being given accommodation in things like travel lodges, stuff like that, in order to give them a better way of life, if only for a short while. There have been lots of stories of NHS workers going and living in caravans so that they could continue operating at work, but not going home and infecting their families. There have been people talking about how we can help the isolated, how we can do food drops for people who are self-isolating at the moment, how we can actually interact with people who are housebound, perhaps by telephone calls or by WhatsApp messages. And time for family has become really important, as well as actually rediscovering the natural world. So actually our values have been shifting, and this is all just in 2020. Third thing that Tearfund have identified is that from these small tweaks to a new way of living, a new way of being, we actually have a chance to reshape culture and society in 4 different areas. And this also is a lot of these are incorporated, these ideas are reflected in the vision for our church as well. It kind of is 2 sides of the same coin in some ways. So first of all, domestic poverty. So the need to address social issues that existed before the pandemic and are exacerbated within it. And Marcus Rashford is, and his campaign for school meals during the school holidays is one example of a celebrity that's actually been using his status to actually change things for the better. Global poverty, the second thing is global poverty. We actually need a global plan, a global health plan, focusing on helping the poorest countries to respond and making sure the vaccine's available to all. I'm pleased to say that the UK has signed an agreement some time ago, before the current vaccine was promoted. The UK signed a deal which said that we would share with countries internationally. We wouldn't just buy it all up for ourselves. And lots of other countries have done that too, but that's really important. Small businesses and renewable energy sources will also help. If we concentrate on those, focus on those, they actually increase resilience of farmers and secure harvests in more impoverished communities, which is really important. Thirdly, environmental destruction. Psalm 24 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." And we were singing a couple of songs earlier about the created world and how beautiful it is. Well, we don't want to go and trash it if it's something that actually points us to God. But actually, if we do trash it, then that actually compromises our safety. As I said earlier, it makes environmental destruction makes it more likely for viruses to jump species. Deforestation, mining, the bushmeat trade, animal trafficking, and unsustainable agricultural practices are all likely to have contributed to the current pandemic. The earth is the Lord's, and we need to treat it as such. And finally, climate change, the big one. Much of climate change is actually caused by global warming from emissions of carbon dioxide and methane and other gases as well, but principally those. And they impact the poorest people in the world most. The poorest 3.5 billion people in the world are responsible for 10% of the emissions, but they will suffer the most from the impacts. Or to put it another way, 44% of the world's population produce 10% of the emissions, and they will suffer the most. A difference of 0.5 degree centigrade average increase in temperature on the planet, just 0.5 degree, so going from 1.5 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperature on the average global averages, will make droughts that last twice as long. 116 million extra people will struggle with a daily water supply, and 1.2 million more people are likely to be living in flooded coastal areas where they are unable to grow any crops, somewhere like Bangladesh. And these are the poorest people in the world who are impacted by the way we, amongst other people, are living. These shifts embody so much, and they do in many ways reflect some of the things that some of our values that we've been promoting as a church, and some of the things that were emphasised by Andy in his talk a couple of weeks ago. So those are the areas perhaps we potentially have the opportunity to change, but not I alone. It will be we together. So looking at our response, we've got two options of where we go. We can either stay on the beach, just go back to normal when all this is over and the vaccine's out and everything sorts itself out. We can just go back to normal. Or we can embrace the shifts that we are seeing, the 3 shifts that Tearfund talked about, and we can look at these 3 things and we can try to change. We can value each person for their productivity. We can, because they're all made in the image of God. We can pursue economic recovery measures. We can fast track against the climate emergency we can reduce racial and economic inequalities exposed by the crisis. All of those things are within our grasp, potentially. And if you remember where we started, come to the table, radical hospitality, authentic community, diversity, accessibility, inclusion, bringing the kingdom of God to a post-COVID world. Actually, that's essentially what Tearfund has said. Those three areas that we had up at the top of that slide, that's what we need to do. So how do we go about actually doing that? What can we actually do? Well, I think we join the conversation and catch the second wave. And remember Acts chapter 1, verse 8, and I'm just trying to find where, oh yes, which says, it's talking about Jesus commanded us to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. In other words, actually, it's local, it's national, and it's global. Yes, we start in Buxton, but no, we shouldn't stay there. We need to go beyond that. So how might we embrace this in 2021? Let's just look at each of those very briefly in turn. So locally, I'm not going to expand on this because Joe's talked lots and lots about this, but adopting the vision and values of Buxton Church in the Peak and seeing where that will lead us is the starting point. And we obviously as a church have to unpack exactly how that will look in Buxton. But what about nationally? Well, one possibility is you could join Tearfund's reboot campaign, which is asking all of us to write to the Prime Minister. And I'll explain that in a minute. It's not quite as onerous as it sounds. Asking him to ensure that the response to COVID is global and the reboot works for everybody. Now, what Tearfund have done is that they've drawn up a declaration, which I'll show you in a moment. Oh, okay, I'll show you now. Thank you, Mike. They've drawn up this declaration, which they're asking people to sign and to submit to the Prime Minister. So let's just read it for a minute, see if you agree with it. Dear Prime Minister, the time is now to lead the UK towards a healthier, greener, fairer future. Ahead of hosting the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow in 2021, that's postponed for this year, we can build back better together if we leave no one behind by increasing support to those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and by scaling up investment in renewable energy in developing countries. And by unleashing a clean energy revolution that boosts jobs across the UK, making our transport, power and housing fit for the future and therefore more sustainable. To protect, restore and expand our green and wild spaces, allowing nature to thrive, taking carbon from the air rather than putting it into the air, and boosting health. The UK must lead the world by ensuring our recovery gets us on track to net zero emissions and limits the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees, because we've heard what happens if we don't. Our best chance of building a resilient economy goes hand in hand with tackling climate change. We're ready to play our part and we call you to join us. Now, if we just click on I'm just going to click on the link at the bottom. This is going to take us to, I hope, the Tearfund website. And I just want to show you this so that if you want to follow this through later in your own time. Is that not coming up on your screen?
We're not sure if you can see it.
You might not actually, it's come up on mine, but I don't know if you're able to see it. If you're not, don't worry. It will be on the, I'll put it on, I'll send it out somehow, send the link out. But if you click on it, it comes up with the page, which I'm not sure whether you can see or not, which says sign the Climate Coalition's declaration. It lists that there and it gives you a space to sign and submit and send it to the Prime Minister. So you don't have to start writing a letter that might be a little bit tricky. You can just send that. Okay, so that's one possibility of something that you could do. So join the reboot campaign. As I said, Tearfund is not just collecting money to pay for impoverished communities, although that's important. It's actually trying to change government thinking in this country and beyond as well. So that's something we could do on a national level. And while Marcus Rashford has done brilliant things on a national level, he's a celebrity. It's a lot easier for him to do something alone than it is for us. So by us joining together, we can potentially influence government. Okay, the third thing is global. How can we do things globally? There's very few church leaders that are really talking about how we can impact God's wider creation and impact our global neighbours. We tend to stop before we get to that. And actually, we're told to go to the ends of the earth. It's time for the church to bring these issues into the centre as part of a holistic gospel. And it's time for us to use our voice. And so one of the things that we can do is, we heard last week, I said we come back to last week, is support organisations such as Turning Point. John's already done an advert for it. I've put the link on here, but I suspect if we click on it, you might not be able to see it. So I'm not going to click on it, but I will send the link out. But that link that's on the screen at the moment will take you direct to the Turning Point website, and you can support them. You can go online and order some of the things that John was talking about. You can find out what they're doing. You can do one-off donations or set up regular donations. It's all there on that website. We cannot, as individuals, support the entire world. We can't support everything that's going on. We're not able to do that. So we need to pick and choose. So picking and choosing things where we have a link seems to make sense. So I would suggest, particularly as we've had that talk last week with Emily and Moses, actually supporting something like Turning Point is part of our global plan, our global responsibility. And it would be disingenuous of me not to mention Tearfund. And again, this page here is talking about you and action and how you can support. And this is by lobbying Parliament, by purchasing things. You can obviously donate, but it's actually by trying to create change at a governmental level and actually trying to get laws changed, which then has a trickle-down effect and will impact on the people actually on the ground. So in conclusion, I would suggest there's a significant overlap between what Joe's been sharing over the past few weeks and the way in which attitudes might be changing in our society, and gives us a springboard for the church to get on board. Despite the paradox of how we achieve a new kind of church in the middle of the COVID restrictions, which are going to go on for some time yet, we can still do things even now. As Joe said, we're not given a pass to put our obedience on hold while we wait for things to get back to normal. We're to represent him in our communities amidst this great uncertainty. So just to recap, this is the backdrop. We've got an opportunity for a national response, an opportunity for to value us together, to value life, to reshape culture and society, and that should be reflected locally, nationally, and globally.